Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will be about the third module of the Section 1 in the IBMS digital registration portfolio called Communication. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. We will discuss evidence justification and IBMS evidence suggestions. I will share with you some of my evidence ideas, and we will finish with some helpful tips to make your portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the third module. These are the learning outcomes you should be able to meet when you have completed this module. You should be able to communicate the outcomes of laboratory investigations accurately and reliably to service users, carers, colleagues, and others. You need to be able to use information, communication, and digital technologies competently in your practice. And you need to be able to demonstrate the ability to adapt your communication methods to ensure clear communication with variety of people. When you complete this module, come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that you have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. And the task is, explain the different methods you use to communicate effectively within your department and with service users. So to break it down, first part is asking you to explain different methods you use to communicate effectively. To be able to answer that, you need to know what are the different methods of communication. Think along the lines of verbal, nonverbal, written or visual communication. Then you need to know which methods you use in your practice effectively. Think about active listening, using clear language, using digital tools or choosing the right medium such as face-to-face, over the phone, email, etc. The next part is asking you to specifically focus on the methods you personally use within your department. So just add to the previous part what methods you personally use specifically within your department. Consider active listening, feedback, meetings, huddles, digital tools, software or secure apps, structured documents, and so on. And the last part is asking you to specifically focus on the methods you use to communicate with service users. Elaborate on the previous part and add the methods you specifically use when talking to patients or other service users. They might be the same methods, but they might be different as well. This might depend on the circumstances, whether you are communicating with another professional or a patient or a carer. Consider adjusting your tone, avoiding jargon, using clear and simple language, utilizing body language, eye contact, facial expressions, showing empathy, involving service users in decision, using visual aids, translation services, assistive technology to support communication. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. First information you are getting is telling you what type of evidence IBMS would like you to use. You could use a flow chart, table, spider diagram or an image. This depends on your personal preference. Next is advising you to include different communication types in the evidence. Consider verbal, nonverbal, written, visual, listening, interpersonal or mass communication. The next part of the advice is asking you to add who you use these communication methods with. For example, what method would you use when communicating with your colleague, doctor, another professional, a patient or a carer? They might be same, similar, or different methods of communication. Consider your approach, your tone, your jargon, your body language and facial expressions, use of alternative formats and so on. Next part of the advice is basically telling you the different communication methods, which is very helpful. Try to mention all those methods in your evidence. And if you can, add more. Next part is asking you to include justification in form of a note or annotation to explain why and how you choose specific communication method. Consider colleagues, patients, doctors, carers, the method of communication you use with them, how you choose that method and why. The next part of the advice is asking you to explain how you know your selected method of communication is effective. Consider the message are you communicating. Has it been received and understood? Does it lead to a desirable outcome? Or is it causing issues and misunderstanding? Consider feedback, body language and response of the recipient, outcome, verification of understanding. The next part of the advice is asking you to explain how you adapt your communication style depending on the person you are interacting with. Consider not using medical jargon when communicating with patients as they might not understand. Speaking a bit louder and slower when communicating with someone who has a difficulty hearing. Using interpreter communicating with someone who does not understand English. Using sign language or visual needs when necessary. The last part of the advice is asking you to summarize how you have improved your communication during training in response to feedback. Think about what feedback you received and how you acted on it. How did that experience improve your communication? Have you seen any positive changes in your practice because of that? Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, use information, communication and digital technologies appropriate to their practice. What this standard is trying to find out is whether you can use relevant information, communication and technology available to you that is appropriate, safe, effective, secure, ethical, legal, confidential, accessible and relevant in the context of your professional role. Are you able to apply professional judgment, choose appropriately, adapt, utilize tools or AI assistants, electronic records, or streamline workflow? Are you integrating technology thoughtfully and responsibly into your practice? Also consider emails, voice messages, social media, apps, and so on. The second standard is, understand the need to provide service users or people acting on their behalf with the information necessary in accessible formats to enable them to make informed decisions. What this standard needs you to demonstrate is that you can choose appropriate way of sharing necessary information with service users or their carers. Consider AIS stands for Accessible Information Standard in England, legal and professional duty to meet communication needs, communication method used, accessibility of the format used, for example digital, paper copy, video or voice recording, language used like no jargon, simple, clear and easy to understand, information tailored to needs, empowering them to make an informed decision about their care, inclusive, respecting their beliefs and wishes, explaining care options, risks and benefits in understandable way, support for representatives if needed. Remember, we provide evidence-based, patient-centered care. The third standard is, communicate the outcomes of biomedical procedures. This standard is requiring you to be able to communicate the outcomes or results of biomedical procedures. My belief is, if you understand what you are doing, you will be able to communicate and explain it clearly. Are you able to effectively and accurately laboratory results and investigations to relevant people? Those might be patients, carers, colleagues, or other service users. Consider clear, actionable, secure, confident, timely, accurate, reliable, understandable communication. Also consider methods of communication like secure electronic systems, rapid alerts for critical or unexpected results, digital reporting. Consider content like patient identifiers, clinical details, findings, results, context and interpretations. Consider best practice like authorization, transparency, audit trail, GDPR, and so on. Focus on clarity, understanding, accuracy, reliability, timelines, confidentiality, and documentation. Basically, are you able to ensure the results generated in the lab reach the right people in a right and safe way to support effective care for patients? Those are the standards you have to keep in mind when writing your mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidates' choice evidence and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 6 HCPC standards. And if you download the module descriptors for the registration portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards that have to be met by those 2 pieces of evidence. The first standard is, understand the importance of and obtain valid consent, which is voluntary and informed, has due regard to capacity, is proportionate to the circumstances and is appropriately documented. What this standard is after, is for you to understand the importance of a valid consent. You could start with explaining what is a consent and why we need it. Then ask yourself, what does it mean that the consent is valid, voluntary, and informed? Has the individual giving the consent capacity to make such decision? Is the consent appropriate to the circumstance? And is that well documented? Consider ethical and legal requirement in healthcare to obtain consent, ethical conduct, bodily autonomy, legal protection, data privacy, capacity, safety, proportionate level of detail, voluntary, informed, documented and patient-centered care. Is the consent freely given, specific to the procedure, reversible and informed? Remember, consent shifts position of power and assumption to respect, mutual understanding and communication. The second standard is, use effective and appropriate verbal and nonverbal skills to communicate with service users, carers, colleagues, and others. To meet this standard, you need to demonstrate you can effectively communicate by using effective and appropriate verbal and nonverbal skills. Consider language used, active listening, clarity and simplicity, empathy, tone and volume of your voice, patience, body language, eye contact, facial expressions, gestures or personal space. How do you adjust those to the circumstance, depending who you are communicating with? Consider carers, patients, service users, colleagues, other professionals. Is your communication same for them all, or do you adjust it depending on who you are communicating with? The third standard is, communicate in English to the required standard for their profession, equivalent to Level 7 of the International English Language Testing System, with no element below 6.5. To meet this standard, you will need to be able to communicate effectively in English to required level and provide proof. If an international applicant, and your degree was not assessed in English, can you prove you speak English to a native level? Consider recognized English language tests like OET Occupational English Test or IELTS, International English Language Testing System, TOEFL Test of English as a Foreign Language which is internet-based test. The fourth standard is, understand the characteristics and consequences of verbal and nonverbal communication and recognize how these can be affected by difference of any kind including, but not limited to, protected characteristics, intersectional experiences and cultural differences. You could start with showing your understanding of the characteristics of verbal and nonverbal communication such as use of words, active listening, tone, pitch, clarity, consistency, body language, facial expression, intentional or non-intentional, culture-bound. Then bring in the consequences of communication, positive and negative. Consider information exchange and immediate feedback for verbal, first impressions, cues and cultural differences for nonverbal, trust, rapport, conflict, misinterpretation, influence, power for combined. Also consider adjustments like inclusive practice, awareness or reflection. The fifth standard is, modify their own means of communication to address the individual communication needs and preferences of service users and carers, and remove any barriers to communication where possible. To meet this standard you need to be able to modify your own way of communication to meet the needs or preferences of the individual you are communicating with. Consider identifying individual needs and preferences by asking them, then consider applying flexible, person-centered, empathetic and inclusive approach, simple and clear language, patience, supportive environment, respect, active listening, appropriate body language, and facial expressions. Then find out what communication barriers are and how you would remove them, where possible. Consider linguistic, psychological, emotional, cultural, attitude barriers but also environmental barriers. Then consider strategies for removal such as active listening, choosing right communication channels, using clear, simple and concise language, managing emotions, minimizing distractions, seeking feedback, nonverbal cues, communication passport, utilizing interpreters or translators and so on. The sixth standard is, understand the need to support the communication needs of service users and carers, such as through the use of an appropriate interpreter. This standard requires you to understand the need to support the communication needs of service users. Why do you think it is necessary to support communication needs in healthcare? Consider centered, safe and effective care, minimizing errors, improving outcomes, holistic support, accessible information, enhancing emotional well-being, empowerment, autonomy, building trust, reducing anxiety, enabling informed decision-making. Always have those standards in your mind when you are selecting a piece of evidence and then when you it. Bear in mind that those two pieces of evidence you choose have to together demonstrate all those 6 standards. One more thing you have to include when choosing and writing your evidence. And that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want you to do that piece of evidence. I would strongly advise you to read their justifications, as this can form the basis for how you be justifying your choice of evidence. You should also include what standards you have met by your chosen evidence. Think about what type of evidence you have chosen, then think why you have chosen that particular evidence, and think which standards you are meeting with that evidence as well. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as the choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good and can meet several standards, which is what you need. And these are a few ideas of types of evidences you could also consider. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make your portfolio look really good. Try to present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs, or even videos, if you can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in specialist portfolios. Try to make it a little bit more interesting to the reader, which will be your training officer and eventually the verifier. Try to put yourself in their shoes. How would you like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share with you my evidence I used for my portfolio back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also try to use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each subsection. You could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of you performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and verification evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Try to bring in your personality. Think about the ways you like to learn best. If you like experimenting, perform experiment. If you like troubleshooting, perform troubleshooting. Choose something that demonstrates your understanding, knowledge, skills, and how you apply this in your practice. And one more thing, keep the competence requirements in mind when you selecting your evidence. Good evidence will tick off several requirements. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting and approaching your evidence. Bye for now.